it was a lot of fun. And we got a chance to talk about other stuff besides reading Torah and the like. So it'll be cute. It'll be fun today. They'll be good. It's really Mutt and Jeff because, Noah's a year and a couple of months older, and he just started growing this year. So he's a good foot taller than his brother. I mean, Ethan was born 3.5 months premature on Groundhog Day on 2/2. And he was born weighing 2 pounds, 2 ounces. And he was born at 222. And he was born, they said blind, deaf, and probably mentally deficient. Okay, well, that's fine. And as Dina said, well, that's okay. I'll just learn a new language and we'll speak with hands and stuff. But he's fine. He was on oxygen for a long time, and his eyesight's good, his hearing is good, and his head is certainly not deficient. He's as smart a kid as you'd want. So he's cute. But it's funny because Noah has a deep bass voice. I mean, like off the table deep. And Ethan is a little bit squeaky still. But, one of these days he'll be 14 and he'll have a deeper voice too. And maybe he'll grow a few inches this year, and that would be nice too. So we'll see. But they're both just really sweet kids.
Well, we wish you and Ricky and everybody Mazel Tov. It's a joyous occasion in the midst of
Thanks.
The midst of it all. And it looks like we have a new face with us, Jessica. I don't know if ever met. Have we met Jessica before? Hi, Jessica. Welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, Jessica,
we could be playing Hollywood squares because nobody's squares would match up. No 2 screens. So I would say she's down on the second row, 4 over, but that could be Andrea. So whatever. Nice to have you with us.
Oh dear. So how is everybody else doing?
Fine, thank you.
Well,
good.
My novel is proceeding apace. I'm on chapter 29. I still have no idea who did it, but I'll figure out. I'm thinking that by the time I get to chapter 31 or 2, I should have a pretty good clue as to who did it. And then maybe I'll find out what they did, because I'm still not clear on all that. But this novel is sort of writing itself, and I'm just having a good time. I just write, and all of a sudden a new character pops in and populates the scene and takes over the dialogue. And I have no idea where it's going. But as long as they're having a good time, what the heck? I'll just be their puppet master.
Rabbi, that's what you're supposed to do with writing, is have fun.
Yeah.
This
has just been a kick. It's just been
It reminds me of this class a little bit.
Yeah, freewheeling and
this. I don't know, Anita. This is thoroughly planned. Thoroughly planned.
No, somebody new pops in, and suddenly we're off with a new direction.
Well, your subconscious is working on it while you sleep, walk, take a shower, whatever. And that's what happens is then, you get in touch with what's been going on in there. Yeah. So
Go to a psychic and ask, how does this end? I don't know. I'm a psychic. I don't know.
Well, we sort of do our best to limp through Torah. That may be the title of a new book, Limping Through Torah. And maybe limping through Torah with Jacob, because he certainly limped through Torah. He limped through Genesis anyway. He disappeared after Genesis, but his ancestors didn't, so that's okay. That's good. Last week we ended with, I guess we ended Deuteronomy 17, and this week we're starting, Deuteronomy 18. Does anybody have any questions before we kick off the session? Okay. Everybody knows how to turn off their mute, right? In case you do have a question. Okay, please don't hesitate. I just assume this didn't become an hour and a half dialogue here, a monologue. Anyway, so let's take a look at the first verse of chapter 18, and we're ready to go. So in the past chapter, in chapter 17, we were talking about the law, the Torah, as pertaining to a king, to a ruler. And ultimately, a Levitical priest was supposed to write a copy of the Torah for the king.
Wayne?
And in writing this copy of the Torah, we don't know whether it was supposed to be a copy of Deuteronomy, a copy of the entire Torah, or a compendium of all the laws in Deuteronomy or in Torah. So consequently, this king, who was not chosen by the people, the people merely had the opportunity of saying, we want a king. Once the people elected to have a king, it was God through prophet who chose the king. And from then on, the monarchy passed down from father to son until there was no son and the dynasty ended and a new dynasty began.
I have a question about that, because
Okay.
I just read Samuel. Samuel was totally against the whole idea. He was
Right,
even angry at the people.
right.
So I don't understand how it all happened, because if Samuel's standing there saying, I'm really angry at you, you're making a bad decision, this
Right.
is terrible, and then he appoints Saul.
Well, because ultimately he was told he had no choice in the matter because the people wanted a king. So he gave them the king they would least have suspected would be a king. He gave them a shlemazel. Well, not really a shlemiel, kind of. A guy who just happened upon the scene. And he picked him for what reason? He picked him because he was the smallest, the tallest guy from the smallest tribe.
Right.
He was an oversized member of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, you could say that this was happenstance, but then again, think about what's going to happen. What is Benjamin? Benjamin is the tribe
Gets absorbed.
in which Jerusalem is found. Now, there is no Jerusalem yet because the area is still owned by the Jebusites, or the area that is going to ultimately become the site of the temple is still in the hands of the Jebusites, a small kind of non-distinct people, really a small people, probably numbering in the dozens, who essentially settled on these two mountaintops, overlooking the Dead Sea on the east, and overlooking the plains of Sharon on the west. So it's an ideal spot for a palace or for a temple or for a place that needs to stand up high for a country's capital, so to speak. But Jerusalem has not been established yet, and yet Benjamin, the tribe in which it is located, has as the first king of Israel a member of its own tribe. So this kind of foreshadows where the monarchy will establish itself sooner or later. Obviously, since Jerusalem doesn't exist yet, the monarchy is going to be a roaming monarchy. It's going to basically have no capital. It's going to zip around in a 3-city area well north of Jerusalem and south of the Galilee, in an arc of cities, the main city being Shiloh, where the Ark of the Tabernacle happens to reside in the hands of a priest named Eli, who is blessed with 2 miserable sons, Hophni and Pinchas, who are going to die a terrible death, and Pinchas and Eli is also going to die a terrible death, but he is going to be the one who places Samuel in charge of the people, in charge of the country. And Samuel then will appoint the king. So this is kind of a, Samuel sort of sets the country up for a center in Jerusalem, or at least in the heart of the smallest tribe, Benjamin. And even though Samuel doesn't want a king, the people have spoken and they picked the king. They made the choice of having a king because they, quote, wanted to be like all the nations around them. I don't know if that answers your question, Amy, but you have a follow-up on it, or does that do it?
No, that's okay.
Well, boy, that's a resounding vote of confidence.
Well, it just, Samuel said over and over again, this is the wrong thing. God's your king. This is the wrong thing.
Yeah.
God's your king. See Saul standing above all the people and says, okay, he's the king.
And he makes him go through hoops too.
Right.
He anoints him in about half a dozen places, right? And he yells at him every time he shows up late or he comes early, or why did you do this? In other words, he's like really passive aggressive with Saul. There's no non-passive aggressive moment that Samuel and Saul are together. Even after Samuel is dead, the first thing he says, that he says to Saul when he is brought back by the witch of Endor, the first thing he says is, why did you bother me? Why did you disturb me? Right? He's been brought back, to have another shot at existence. What are you waking me up for? So Saul can do no right for Samuel. And Samuel has already told the people, you don't want a king. He's going to take your women. He's going to take your horses. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your property. You're going to hate it. You're going to not like, we want a king. Okay, so I'll give you a schlemiel for a king. Here he is. And you aren't going to like it. I'm not going to like it, but here he is. You wanted it, you got him. And almost from the get-go, Samuel is already predicting that David is going to take his place. And Samuel is forced into an unhappy situation where on the one hand, he's got to fight the Philistines. And on the other hand, he's got to look out. He's got to watch his back because he's afraid that David is going to kill him or harm him. And David goes through hoops to prove he's not going to lay a hand on the king. He finds him in a cave sound asleep, and he clips a little piece off of the end of his robe. And then he goes across a mountain pass and he yells for him. He says, King, look, I have a piece of your robe in my hand. I could have killed you 5 times over and I wouldn't touch a hair on your head. Here, look, here's your robe. And even so, Saul still goes pursuing after him, which really makes him a schlemiel. I mean, he just could have let it go and had a straightforward kingship without having to worry about David, because David wasn't going to bother him. He was going to let him act out his kingship in peace. But then again, what would be the fun of a book of the Bible unless there was some tension in it? So that was the tension.
Something just occurred to me when the time of the kings first arrived. The people said they wanted a king, but they didn't choose the king. God chose the king. And God did not choose a perfect person. God said, you have to learn from this thing that I'm going to give you with all the structures that are important for you to learn. And you're to carry this, I guess it was a book or a scroll, whatever it was, with you at all times. And in addition to what's in there, you also have to learn all the laws. So the laws weren't in there because that wasn't in that first paragraph. That was later on, the one that we just finished. So I'm thinking that what God is, now I'm being presumptuous because I'm saying what God is thinking, and how would I know what God is thinking? But I'll take a step at that. God is saying that anyone can be king if he's willing to follow the rules. And the rules are: carry this with you, learn to be a pious person, respect me, honor me, learn the laws. And if you can do all that, then you're a good king. And if you can't,
I think you got it backwards, though. I think I'm going to pick the king, and then the king's supposed to do all those things. You don't do all those things and therefore become king.
no, I get that. That's what I meant. Maybe it didn't come across that way.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if the king doesn't do all that, there was nowhere that it said God got rid of the king and chose another one. He constantly gave the king an opportunity to act in a king-like fashion. And the king got rid of, the king was replaced by another king chosen by God, who was then given the same opportunity. So he was trying to have people help him, ordinary people, become his servants, people who would help him along to make a perfect place. And some did, some didn't.
Okay, just keep in mind that this part of Torah was nowhere to be found when Saul was king. In other words, Saul and David never read Deuteronomy.
I know that.
And Solomon never read Deuteronomy either. So we're talking about Hezekiah, Josiah. We're talking about 621 before the Common Era. And so any king ruling before that might not have known about the law to keep a Torah with them, and therefore know the laws and judge by the laws. This is sort of imposed upon, quote, the two great kings of Judah. Hezekiah and Josiah were among the greatest two kings of Judah. Not in terms of expanding territory or anything such as Solomon may have done, but certainly in terms of wisdom. They were both brilliant. Hezekiah built a tunnel leading from the upper mount of the palace down to the Silwan pool, so that there would never be an opportunity for outside enemies to cut off the water source. And Josiah destroyed all of the syncretic worship places of the people in the 7th century before the Common Era. So, there were two, and he also rebuilt the temple. He remodeled it, refashioned it, so there's lots to be said about the two kings responsible for the book of Deuteronomy. Anyway, so the king is told that he has to judge according to this Torah that he has, whether it's a book of just the laws or whether it's the book of Deuteronomy, or whether it's the whole Bible, or the whole Torah. And now, chapter 18 begins with a discussion. We're finished with kings, and now we're focused on the priests, on the priesthood.
So, Rabbi Z, here's my question here.
Yeah.
So when we get into this verse, I don't ever remember seeing in other times the whole tribe of Levi. They talk about tribe of Levi, they talk about Levitical priests, but here it's called Shabbat, the whole tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get into it, bring us through it a little bit.
Yeah, I will do that.
You see where I'm at?
I see it. Yeah, Kol Shevet Levi. Yeah. I'm not sure that the word kol, the word all, is indicative of anything. The word that bothers me is shevet. Tribe.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, but it's emphasis here. The Levitical priests, the whole tribe shall have no. It's emphatic that leaves no room. And I think this is going to deal with about inheritance and portion and their role in Israel. And it's just, when we've looked at other texts, when they refer to the Levitical priests, it hasn't been as specific as, I want to say, these legal, your lineage here. This is really if we talk about really a piece of text.
Right. Now,
You're muted. Rabbi Z, you're muted. You're still muted.
I'm getting there.
Okay, now you're back.
I have no idea how that happened. So Levi was the third son of Jacob and Leah, and he never became a tribe, even though he's one of the 12 sons. And so therefore, when it says Shevet, tribe, that's really kind of interesting, because he was never called a tribe. He was called Haleviim, the Levites, not the tribe of Levi, but the Levites, the descendants of Levi. They were not called a tribe anywhere else that I know of, because tribes were entitled to an inheritance of land in the promised land. And Levi was on purpose not given any land. That is, was not given a tribal area that was its own. There is no section of Israel that is marked out for a tribe called Levi. There's a section for Issachar, and there's a section for Asher, there's a section for Dan, and for Gad, and for Reuben, and for Benjamin, and Judah, and Manasseh, Ephraim. But there is no tribal land, contiguous territory for Levi. Doesn't exist. So let's just see what happens here, because that's what the first verse is all about. It says, Lo yiyeh lekohanim haleviim. There shall not be for the Levitical priests kol shevet Levi. I think the only way to read that is any descendant of the house of Levi, or anyone who calls himself a Levite, or anyone who would have been part of the tribal area known as Levi. You get no possession of land. Chelik v'nachala im Yisrael lo yiyeh lechem. You will not get a portion or an inheritance of the land of Israel, Am Yisrael, with the people of Israel. Is that Am or Im? That might be im. In the land called Israel. Gishe Adonai nachlato yochelun. Rather, you shall eat from the fires of the Lord as your inheritance. You shall eat from them, from the fires of God. That is, from the sacrificial offerings. That's going to be your portion. Your inheritance is the sacrificial offerings, and the sacrificial altar. That's your place. You get no other part of land. In a few seconds, when we get to the next verse, we're going to see something entirely different. But for now, the tribe of Levi gets no land. So the question is this whole idea of becoming a special group within the group a good thing, or is it a punishment? I just leave it as a question. You can answer it. Is it a punishment, or is it a blessing, a reward of some sort?
Why do you frame it either or?
Oh, well, how would you frame it?
It is.
Both.
It's a distinct role. I mean, because as you get through this whole book of Deuteronomy now, where we're looking at the text, you have to give a clear yichus. You have to give the authority of the system to the priests to carry out all their functions as they go forward. And it's these texts that set forth to say, who gave you the authority to say that, you don't own, it's like, leave the politics out. Like DC is a no person's land. You don't have a senator that represents Washington, DC. It's a no man's land. It's, really run by Congress in some ways. So you have no territory except you have tremendous authority. And here, the Levites are going to have tremendous authority over how ritual is done, right?
Mhm.
And that they're going to be federal employees for the rest of their life, that they're going to live off the till of the land. By not owning territory, you give up. So I'm not sure it's either or, it's just a frame of it.
But the source of financial power, the source of success was by how many animals you had. And they have no way to measure their, I don't know, material success. I don't know how to put it.
But Amy, it's much like the politicians, they just can increase the taxes. They don't know how much money you have. They just say, pay more, pay more. So this is, I don't care where you get your animals from. You have to meet the quota of the firstborn. If it's 1 or if it's 50, that you're bringing. And so there's this whole notion of you're beginning to get a beginning sense of moving from tribe taking care of one another to a master tribe that all the other tribes help contribute to. And that's the shift here in Deuteronomy. Because the whole book of Deuteronomy is just setting up this centralization of Jerusalem as the Washington, D.C. You could stop Torah after the last book. The whole purpose of Deuteronomy is both a recapitulation of everything that's happened in the first 4, and now we've got to add in the Levitical priestly material to codify the authority. And that's why if you read this, you can say, oh, I can see why, but it's just to make sure that I get my portion.
They're the bureaucracy.
It's the beginning of governmental bureaucracy. It's the beginning of when you add things into legislation that has nothing to do with the legislation at hand. Let's see what we can pork barrel. And this is one of the first examples we're beginning to see.
What would the Levites think of this? Did they volunteer? Were they drafted?
Who?
What do they feel about having more rules than everybody else?
Who? The priests?
The Levitical tribe.
Yeah, they really did have more rules to follow than anyone else.
Yeah.
They had the onus of half of Leviticus and half of Numbers in terms of following the rules and regs for that pertain to sacrifices. So yeah, they certainly had more rules than anybody else had to follow. That's for sure. So the question really is, what were they? Was their lot a happy one, or was their lot a dreary one?
Rabbi, I would like to make a stab. The question of was it a blessing or a curse, happy or not happy? It depends on the values that you give to the fires of taking from the fires of a god versus land. It's the whole question of exactly what is important in life, and if you ascribe to eating from the fires of the Lord a higher value than that of working with the land, then it is a blessing. If you put the eating of the fires of the Lord, that it is not as important as working and gaining from the land, then it is a curse. So it depends upon, I think, it depends upon what importance, what value you give to the spiritual versus the physical, and that's how I answer the question as to whether it's a blessing or a curse.
I can resonate to that, Mel. Yeah, you can look at it both ways. I tend to look at it a bit more cynically than just about anybody else I know. I think it was a terrible, an onerous burden to be a priest in biblical times, because essentially you worked in an abattoir all day, and you were around the smoke and the fire of burning flesh and blood, and you know, you were one step worse than a veterinarian in cow country. It was holy work, but it was also messy work. Now, most people in biblical times were used to being farmers. They were always surrounded by the smell of camel dung and cattle dung and sheep dung and goat dung and dung. And, you know, so the smells and the inconveniences and the rest were just sort of the given of life. But no farmer in biblical times could really afford often to roast a lamb. I mean, that just would not have crossed their mind. So that when Torah says that Abraham sent his boy to prepare a calf for the strangers that came to visit, that was a major league feast for three strangers. That was no simple thing. That was not take a steak out of the freezer. That was do away with a money producing animal and offer it up, roast it, dress it, what have you, and serve it to these three strangers I never saw before. That was something special. So here are the priests, and they don't just live in Jerusalem where the temple is. They are itinerant. They live in communities around the country, because people, when they can't get to Jerusalem, still have offerings to make. They still have a tithe to give to God. They're not really giving the tithe to the priest. They're not giving the tithe to the temple. They're giving the tithe to God. And therefore, that tithe has to be sacrificed in its time. And if you can't get to Jerusalem where the temple is, you have to get to an altar somewhere where there's somebody who can offer it on behalf of God. And that would be a Levite, maybe a chief Levite in any one of the cities that we'll talk about in a second, who was called a Kohen for that region. He was the chief sacrificer for that region. So there would have been maybe established a group of Kohanim who had supervising power over the Leviim, the Levites, in the non-Jerusalem areas of the land of Israel. Even after the northern kingdom had been destroyed, there were still Jews living there. I have this sense that on the one hand, the priests were probably the best fed group of people in the whole community, because they obviously got to participate in the meat offerings, whereas most of the farmers were doing grains and fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, olives, wine. But the priests were, they got 3 parts of a cow. And those were the choicest parts of the cow, which we'll find out in a couple of verses. And, and then if a person who came and offered that cow, depending on what the offering was, got at best what was left over. And that was a meal that they didn't often get unless it was their animal that they brought to sacrifice.
So to be a Kohen, you need to be a Levi, a Levi first?
Yeah, you have to be a Levite. Yeah, you could only be a Kohen if you were a Levite.
Kohens were Aaron's ancestor.
Yeah.
Does it have anything to do with commerce? Because there were so many more, because of matrilineal and paternal descent. I noticed that at Mount Nebo, there's a lot more Levites that are buried than Kohens. And I wonder if that was just because there were so many more of them, and that by keeping that class of people in a supportive role, that you're encouraging good commerce.
Are you talking about going out to the cemetery Mount Nebo and seeing Levites?
Yeah, like I didn't even know that both of my grandmothers were Levites, or my grandfathers were Levites.
Oh, that's because they had they had the
and the stone, it says over there.
Yeah.
Halevi.
Yeah. Well, that usually is the mark of a Kohen, of a high priest who gave the blessing. But a Kohen was a Levite. A Levite was not necessarily a Kohen. A Kohen was the chief Levite. And now it may very well have been that there was a chief Levite wherever there was a sacrificial altar. And there were 48 of them throughout the country. So there might have been as many as 48 Levites. When Aaron was the high priest, his 4 sons were also Kohens. So in that case, there were 5 in one family who were high priests who could oversee the offerings at the temple. Now, granted, think about this for a minute. You've got 3 sacrificial offerings 6 days a week. And on Shabbat, you've got 4 sacrificial offerings. And each sacrificial offering consists of at least one animal and usually multiples of animals. And then when you get to the holidays like Pesach, and especially Sukkot, Sukkot was like a mind-boggling offering of animals like you cannot believe. You just read about Sukkot in Leviticus. It's like 500, 600, 800 animals offered in an 8-day period. It's an absurd amount of animals that are offered up. So this falls upon the 5 high priests to officiate at each one of these sacrifices. And then you've got a bazillion Levites, worker bees, who are getting rid of the blood and are carving up the animal and are putting the pieces on the fire. The Levite is responsible really for shechting the animal, cutting its throat, and sprinkling the blood on the altar. Every animal that was sacrificed, you had to take a bit of parsley or some sort of hyssop's, some sort of a leafy bush, and dip it in the blood and sprinkle it on the sides of the altar. And that was the official offering, that sprinkling of the blood. And then the rest of the blood was drained from the animal, and the animal was then investigated, examined, its lungs were examined, and its heart and its liver and everything was examined. And if the animal was without blemish inside and out, then the skin was taken off and the animal was roasted on the sacrificial barbecue, which is really what it was. It was an enormous barbecue.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I think the priests and the Levites also had other responsibilities. Teaching, building inspector, health inspector. You know, if you think about confession and forgiveness, maybe psychological duties. But the question you ask is just as applicable to every one of us, because we're all supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And I imagine the answer to that question is how we all fulfill our responsibilities to society and to each other.
That's a rabbinic drash.
It's a pretty tough thing.
Yeah, well, so have you gone outside and caught one of those deer and offered it up yet?
No.
Steve watches deer walk by his front door every day, and I'm just thinking, a perfect opportunity to make an offering to the Lord. Yeah, well, and the priests were also the medical people too, because they investigated illnesses, leprosy, and which were considered to be divine punishments, and they also investigated mold in a house, and they had the final say as to whether the house gets cleaned up or burned down to get rid of the virus, the infection, and the like. So, yeah, and the priests were the scribes, and the priests were the teachers, and the priests were the medical people. But the priests were the only ones that really had free time. A farmer didn't have any free time, and a herdsman didn't have any free time. They were always taking care of their animals, and or taking care of their crops, or planting, or reaping, or sowing, or whatever they do. So they had no time, and the priests did, because there was time in between offerings, and and I think it was a job for Levitical families too, because the women also had to work. They had to make the outfits for the priests. They had to clean the outfits that were schmutzed up in the offerings of sacrifice. You couldn't have a priest go out to minister at the altar in a grease-covered uniform, what have you. So there was a whole manufacturing process going on, and the women and the kids were responsible for a lot of that. And we also realize that the Levitical family, tribe, whatever you want to call it, was not confined to itself. That every firstborn Israelite male could become, actually was at birth, a Levite. That is a firstborn male son of a woman, considering she had not had a miscarriage before. But if it was a firstborn, first, as they said, opening of the womb, that child was automatically a Levite.
Well, Hannah,
And was brought into a Levitical family to live. And that kid was now a priest forever, and his descendants were Levites.
well, Hannah did that.
What?
Hannah did that.
Hannah did that, exactly. Hannah gave Samuel over to Eli the priest. Hannah did exactly that. She left her son to be a Levite, and therefore he was able to become a priest and also a prophet. And that's where we get the concept of pidyon haben, of redeeming the firstborn. Because if a family said, I don't want my kid to go live with a Levitical family, I want my kid home raising sheep for me, I want my kid in my family, then you had to buy him back from the priesthood with 5 pieces of silver. And that was called redeeming your son. Pidyon means redeeming, haben, the son, as it is stated in Torah. It's mandated in Torah. If you want to redeem your son, you have to redeem him from a priest. Well, anyway, so the Levitical priests, according to verse 1, had absolutely no portion in the land of Israel. No. Again, let me explain that there were 12 sons of Jacob and a daughter, Dinah, but 12 sons of Jacob. And there were 12 tribes. But the 12 sons of Jacob were not the 12 tribes of Israel. Because 2 of the sons, Levi and Joseph, did not have tribes. They didn't have tribe. There is no tribe of Joseph, and there is no tribe of Levi. But instead, how do you make up for those 2 that are now missing? There should only be 10 tribes if there is no tribe of Joseph and Levi.
Joseph's sons.
Exactly, Joseph's sons. So those are the grandsons of Jacob, not the sons of Jacob. But Ephraim and Manasseh each becomes a tribe, and now you're back up to 12 tribes. In fact, you could say that there were 13 tribes because Manasseh was split in half, and half lived on the west side of the Jordan, and the other half lived on the east side of the Jordan. So it's called the half tribe of Manasseh in either place. But I guess a half plus a half still equals 1 tribe. 12 tribes of Israel.
So, Rabbi, I'm thinking why the Levites were given this other job and they were sort of guaranteed food. So what do you need a piece of land for? You need a piece of land to raise your grain and grow your food and have your animals. Well, they didn't need that land because they were getting fed.
Yeah, they were. They were getting fed well because they were getting first grains, they were getting first oils, they were getting first meat. So
and it seems to me that there was too much food for them. So what happened to the rest of the food? I mean, you can say, well, they sold it back to somebody, or you can say they gave it to the poor, or they had a feast every day, and everybody that gave them the food then was able to partake of it.
Well, I would think that on Sukkot, they certainly had too much left over. But on most days of the week, they didn't, because they were feeding all of their families off of that food. And certain offerings were communal offerings. And so there was a buffet effect where people could come in and participate in eating of the so, you know, Thanksgiving offerings and whole and shlamim offerings, whole offerings were communal offerings, and they could be shared with anybody. But other offerings were specifically for the Levitical families. You know, one priest could be feeding 7, 8 children and perhaps even 2 or 3 wives. You know, so you've got a lot of mouths to feed, and there probably wasn't that much left over except on major holidays and maybe even Shabbat. Did stuff go to waste? Yeah, I would doubt it. There's probably a whole lot of paupers and a whole lot of hangers-on who came for the scraps. So I have a feeling they cleaned the table pretty well. Yeah. Just sort of like restaurants in the big city, you know. If they wanted to, they could distribute everything left over at the end of the day and not have a speck for the garbage can, because there are always people who are homeless and in need and haven't eaten, and they could always find a place to give it.
And we have so many, and Rabbi, we have so many good programs in Denver before COVID-19 that would do that.
Yeah.
They work with big hotels, and they work with the caterers, and you know, because before there were state rules that you couldn't take food once it was out.
Yeah.
And give it away because of liability, and so much of that food ends up in our shelters now. So Colorado and particularly Denver and Boulder have been doing this for a long time. We've set this stage for the rest of the country.
Yeah, which is as it should be. I mean, to let a lot of food go to waste at the end of a day is almost criminal. It just should never happen, especially when there's so many people hungry. Okay, so the priests are going to live on the Lord's offerings, the fire that they make on the altar, and they're going to live off of that. So we get to verse 2, V'nachala lo yiyelo b'kerev echav Adonai, hu nachlato ka'asher diberlo. So you shall have no portion, no inheritance in the midst of your brothers, in the midst of his brothers, b'kerev echav. Adonai hu nachlato. God is his inheritance, as God spoke to him. So God is his inheritance as God spoke to him. That's in Numbers, somewhere in Numbers 18, somewhere around there. That the Levites are and also in Exodus somewhere, Exodus 25, 6, somewhere in there. So the priests are, God is the inheritance of the priests. That's their deal. Now, the question is, what happens with all these priests who are going to minister in the far reaches of the country? Well, in Numbers 18, middle of somewhere around 20, we are told that there are going to be 48 specific areas for the priests to dwell in. And these 48 areas are scattered all over the east bank and the west bank of the Jordan River. Transjordan and Cisjordan, east and west. And these areas consist of approximately 2,000 square cubits. So that's 3,000 feet by 3,000 feet. Not a huge area, but on the other hand, 3,000 is a lot of football fields when you stop to think about it. It's It's 100 yards by 100 yards. It's 10 football fields by 10 football fields. So it's a significant piece of land, but it's not overwhelmingly large. And it's in those territorial areas, these 48 areas, that the priestly families would reside for the priest who ministered to the area around that one square cubit area. And within that area, they farmed, they raised some grain, they raised some fruit, perhaps, some vegetables, perhaps. They didn't have to raise farm animals because they were going to be sacrificing those animals anyway. But they certainly had to raise extra food so that they could feed their children. And it's within those areas that these Levites and Levitical families lived and ministered to the needs of the farming communities and ranching communities around them in their immediate vicinity. So, so the Levites did have pieces of land, but they had no contiguous territorial area. Any questions? You can read about it in Numbers 18:20, where specifically the Levites are told that God is their inheritance and not the land of Israel, and that they have to live off the fires of the land of the sacrifices. Any comments, questions, concerns? Okay, so we move on to verse 3, and here we get into the specifics of what the priest is entitled to when he offers a sacrifice. Kind of interesting that we go as deep into this as to know the offering itself. Zeh mishpat kohanim. No, we're not talking here about Levites now. We're talking about Kohanim, but I would assume that it really refers to the Levitical families and the Levites and the Kohanim. So this is the law concerning the priests. Me'et ha'am, me'et zovchei hazevach, im shor, im seh, v'natan lakohen, hazaroa, halachayim, v'hakever, or hakever. So this is the law concerning the priest. When he gets something from the people, a sacrifice to sacrifice, whether it's an ox or it's a sheep, or whether it's an ox or it's a sheep, v'natan lakohen, and this part of the animal is given to the priest, hazaroa, the shoulder, v'halachayim, and the cheeks, and we're pretty sure it means this area of the cow, but it could mean the rear end of the cow. However, the rear end of the cow is somewhat circumspect because the rear end of the cow, the flank of the cow, cannot be eaten because it has a vein running through it, the sciatic nerve actually running through it, the Gid HaNasheh, it's called in the Torah. And that can't be eaten because Jacob, after he wrestled, was touched on the thigh and he walked with a limp. And from that time on, the Jewish people do not eat the thigh of an animal because of that sciatic nerve running through it. So
which means there's no kosher filet mignon.
It's not.
What about chicken?
However, there are kosher butchers in New York, starting in the 1800s, who figured out a way of exorcising. I think the word is excising, but maybe it's exorcising the gid hanasheh from a flank steak. The process was called traubing or traubing, and they would cut. They take the flank steak and they would cut, throw it through it in long strips, and they would carefully remove the entire nerve or vein or whatever it was. They literally lift it out, and then the flank could be eaten because it no longer had a gid inside of it, no longer had that strip inside of it. And you paid a lot of money for a flank steak because of that process. But, with a little soy sauce and a little lemon juice, that's a pretty tasty piece of meat. And so, therefore, even to this day, there are Orthodox who can still get away with eating what was biblically forbidden.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
don't they do that in Israel because of the scarcity of the beef?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're great traubers in Israel. They can whip that vein out in no time flat. They have excellent butchers and
You can get a shmita as a rabbi to cut that out. That's your only obligation, is to do that as a rabbi.
That's possible. While his son is polishing a diamond, he's pulling out the vein of a cow.
Well, you want to have a brisket sandwich to celebrate, I guess.
As long as they don't get their professions mixed up, they're okay.
I wonder if you can be a moil and a guy who takes the nerve out.
So anyway, you get the shoulder, you get the cheeks, whether it's the front cheeks or the back cheeks, and you get the stomach. Now, I don't know. I mean, between you and me, I'd be more than happy to give up the stomach. I'd trade the stomach for, say, unless, of course, we're not talking about the internal organ. We're not talking about the inside stomach. We may be talking about the chuck roast around the gut, which is probably pretty tasty meat, especially if you wanted to make a stew, or if you wanted to make cholent.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say the stomach and the intestines are used a lot by the Native Americans to make all kinds of stuff. It was actually pretty valuable for holding things.
Yeah.
Because it was waterproof, and so there's a lot of stuff made out of it. Perhaps that was its value.
Well, back in the day, and maybe even in this day, the Jews figured out a way to make the most terrible thing for human consumption ever invented, which was kishka, in which they would take the intestine, they would wash it, they would turn it inside out, and they would stuff it with all the things you shouldn't put in it, but which were very tasty. So you had onions, and you had grated carrots, and you had all kinds of bits and pieces of liver and brain and whatever other meats you could think of not putting somewhere else. So you'd stuff it all into this derma, and it was called stuffed derma. And then you'd boil it, and then you'd roast it. And let me tell you, it was pretty tasty back in the day when some of the caterers in town were making it. And then somebody got concerned about cholesterol. And they figured out that that was like glot cholesterol. It was like 100% cholesterol. The only non-cholesterol part was the intestine piece itself. So, so then they decided they were going to make kishka totally out of vegetables. So they made vegetarian kishka. And let me tell you, it was very good. It's very tasty. It was really good. However, I think they used schmaltz. I'm just thinking, I think they used schmaltz. So they called it vegetarian because to some cooks and some caterers, schmaltz was parv. It didn't matter that it came from my chicken. It's schmaltz. Schmaltz is like, put it on everything, right? Schmaltz. Kids got a cold, put a little schmaltz here, it'll be better. That was like Vic Sav for Jewish kids. So schmaltz, the essential.
Rabbi, and a cow has 4 stomachs.
Yes.
And calves have rennet in their stomachs as well, which you can use to make cheese.
Yeah, rennet. That's right. You'd use that. The rennet came from there. Yeah, to make cheese, right. Yeah, it did indeed, Anna. Any other comments?
Yeah,
Oh, I have a
Rabbi.
question.
Oh,
Yeah. Anybody?
all right. I'll go first because it's quick. Anyway, if you go along Broadway or even Colfax, you can find a taco stand and you can get a taco with cheek meat in it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. Beef cheek meat. And I tried it. It's okay.
Cheek meat.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Ooh, wonder where they got that from.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But so the question obviously that the rabbis are going to ask, because you can't get away with just saying 3 parts of a cow and get away with it without asking the question, why dafka those 3? I mean, of all the parts of a cow, why the l'chaim, the cheeks, and the kever, the kever, the stomach, and the zaroa, the shoulder. So naturally, one of the commentators, it was either Ibn Ezra or Rashi, said that the shoulder is connected to the arm which sacrificed the animal. So therefore, that becomes a part of the offering that the priest earned because he sacrificed the animal. The let's see, what else was it? The cheeks, the mouth, was the part of the priest that blessed the offering. So therefore, the cheeks would be part of the thing that symbolically went to the priest. And the keva, the stomach. Oh, because once you slaughtered an animal, you had to investigate its internal organs. Oh, this is something you didn't know. So you had to investigate its internal organs. So the way to investigate the internal organs was you flay the animal, you cut the animal in half, and you separate its rib cage. And the inspector moves his hands along the inside of the outer shell of the rib cage. And if the striations are smooth, that is a perfectly kosher cow. If they are bumpy, but there's no kind of disease evident, then that also is a kosher cow. But if it's absolutely smooth with not a single bump or not enough so that it makes much of a difference, then that cow is called specially kosher or glot kosher. So glot kosher only refers to a cow. You can't have a glot kosher carrot. You can't have a glot kosher chicken. You can't have a glot kosher anything else. You can't have a glot kosher kitchen either, unless of course you only serve glot kosher meat. And if you don't have a meat, you don't serve meat at all, you can't have a glot kosher kitchen because you can't serve glot kosher anything if it isn't the cow. So therefore, you can't have a glot kosher farm foods. It's just, you can't do it, even though in New York they do it.
I would disagree with you in a sense, not me personally, but if you if you call yourself glot kosher, they've gone way beyond the inner lining of the ribs to have a glot kosher everything. And I, not being in the catering business, but having to deal with these people, when I was doing a big dinner, for example, at the Hyatt, and the guy would come along and he would do something and we weren't serving beef, he still would say to me, "This is not a glot kosher meal," intending to say that his observance was better than my observance or the Hyatt's observance. But he'd let me go through this one time, but don't do it again. And then he charged me a fortune.
And he didn't know what he was talking about.
Of course not.
Yes, well, that's the deal. So I'm telling you what glot kosher is by definition. But you know, and what happens is that people then take the word glot kosher to refer to something totally different, like I'm so kosher that I'm glot kosher, which has no meaning whatsoever. It only refers to the smoothness of the striations of the inside of a cow when you investigate it. It's the only thing that has to do with glot.
Rabbi,
Nothing else. Zero, nothing.
I was told it was for the smoothness of the lungs.
Of the what?
The lungs.
Of the, no. Well, I mean, you would investigate the lungs if the lungs had any sign of disease, the whole cow is gone. Doesn't matter how smooth the inside lining of the cow is. You're not going to serve that cow. It's not kosherable. It's no matter how it was killed, it's not a kosher animal if it has disease in any of its organs. So the organs all have to be free of disease, but gluttonous has to do with striations on the side of the beef itself.
So I'm thinking about what it means to put your hands inside the chest cavity, for example, and see that there's no, quote, striations. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
I don't either.
Tuberculosis was common in those days, and you could probably detect that. And I'm sure they didn't understand that tuberculosis you can't get necessarily from eating things, but maybe that's what they were concerned about. I don't know. Any other specific diseases that you think they were concerned about?
Well, first of all, glot, kashrut, and all that stuff it is a later development. It's a rabbinic development, not a biblical development. So I'm sure that by the time we get to rabbinic times in the first couple of centuries, you've certainly had a lot more time and experience with medicine and with the investigating of cadavers and the investigating of animals. The priests were concerned with offering up a kosher animal. They weren't concerned with a perfectly kosher. They were concerned with a healthy animal that had no external or obvious internal blemishes. But by the time you get to the, certainly the first couple of centuries, you've already had people like Galen and Hippocrates and other physicians who have come and started to write medical treatises on health and on illnesses and on diseases and what to look for and that sort of thing. So, you know, the rabbis started becoming more and more observant of what constitutes a kosher animal.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
many Reform synagogues have eternal organs.
Okay.
I was going to say, I'm not going to explain them, you know.
Okay. And if you get an organist who hits the wrong note, then it's not a kosher organ.
Yeah, it's not kosher.
Go ahead. Rabbi, did the other tribes, not the Levites, but the other tribes, did they know that their offerings were being used to feed the Levites?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure.
So that was a mitzvah for them to do that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, no, they brought them willingly. Nobody held a gun to their backs. I mean, they brought them, they slept miles to bring them to the sacrifice. Yes, because it was their duty. Because, you know, it's sort of Jewish karma. If you give a tenth or the firstborn of your flock, of your herd, then you're going to have many more cows emanating from your herd. So you're going to benefit in the long run by offering up the firstborn. It's as simple as that. By offering up the first of your oil, you're going to end up with olives that give much more oil. By offering up the first of your grain, you're going to end up with fields that are far more fertile.
Nowhere did it say the first. Where did excuse me, where did you get that? The first. Nowhere did it say you have to bring the first of whatever, the first of your crop, the first.
Well, I think if you look at verse 4, you might find that it says.
Oh, well, we haven't gotten there yet.
Well, I know, but you asked, where do I get that from? And I'm just telling you, we will get to it. It will be there. It's the next verse. So, yeah.
Well, I'm very happy that
Yeah,
I could segue into this.
You know, you ask a question and
there it is.
The Torah responds. Absolutely.
Well, that's good.
We don't mess around here. These are biblical questions, get biblical answers right away.
Rabbi, and this is not the time for an answer as we approach 12 noon, but at some point, I would like you to choose a time when you feel it's a good time to address a question as to whether it's possible to be a Jew and observe and value Jewish values that have come through. When there still may be questions in your mind about exactly what you believe with a God concept, with a supernatural power that tells you thou shalt or thou shalt not, which tells you whether there can be capital punishment and values that you don't agree with. How can an individual today in 2021 be at peace and reconcile the the feeling of importance of the fundamental values of Judaism, and subscribe to many of the things in the Jewish religion, and still have questions about supernatural powers and things.
Well, Mel, I think if you asked, if you broke that down into about 27 questions, we could kind of try to get to each one at a time. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure I could frame all of that in one answer. So think about putting them in the order in which you'd like them addressed. Now, I'm more than happy to. I can BS with the best of them. So I'm more than happy to give you definitive answers that I think of on the spot. And if you ask me the same question the following week, you could get a variety of answers that were maybe even different from the ones I gave you the week before. So, especially when it comes to talking about God, I like to think of Torah as the constitution of the Jewish people. When I think about the Constitution and the Bill of and the Declaration of Independence, it occurs to me that both of them were written by deists. The word God doesn't occur in the Constitution, and it only occurs once in the Declaration of Independence. And these framers of the Constitution and of the Declaration had a concept of God that they were absolutely terrified that they might in any way, shape, or form posit conceptually. And therefore, they just used the word God baldly without even a hint of what they meant by it. Because, to Washington or to Jefferson or to any of the framers, Adams, they were all deists. They all believed that God was the God of Aristotle, the first mover, and that was it. God rolled the bowling ball, and then whatever happened, happened. And then the pins split, and this one went that way, and that one went this way, and the world just happened because of the first cause. And God has nothing to do with the world since. God was a one-trick pony and started everything and then just said, okay, it's all yours, and walked away. Hypothetically, walked away. Had nothing to do with it after that. Done. So therefore, they saw law, I think, to a certain extent, the same way that the framers of the biblical Constitution saw law, as a means of protecting society from imploding, as a means of putting down laws that would keep people from eating each other. And if you look at the laws, I'm going to say something about that at the bar mitzvah today. I mean, just for a minute, because the kids asked me, what's the relevance of this today? It's going to be a few lines because I wanted to tell them what I thought the relevance was. But if you look at the laws of Torah, those laws are as relevant today as they were when they were written, especially in Exodus, especially in the Torah portion for this afternoon. I mean, the Torah portion for this morning is the 10 Commandments. The Torah portion for this afternoon is Mishpatim. It's the Torah portion with the most laws of any Torah portion in the Torah, is 53 laws. So 53 commandments. But if you look at those 53 commandments you can apply them to today as well as they were applied to yesterday. They work today as well as they worked 2,800 years ago when they were written. Their human nature doesn't change. People don't change. The circumstances change, and things look like they're a little bit different. And technology certainly makes things different, but essentially underneath it all, people are the same bundle of nerves and dreams and thoughts and conflicts and confusions and ideologies and disturbances of the brain cells. And we have the same dreams, the same needs, the same wants. For some, those wants are greater than for others. Some absolutely have to have the attention, the spotlight. Some have to have power. Some have to have money. Some have to have lots of animals. Some have to have a big house. Some have to have a little something. You know, the great literature of Jewish, of Jewish history is written in the 1800s, 1900s, when Isaac Babel and Isaac Bashevis Singer and Sholem Asch and some of the great writers of Jewish history write, and along comes a guy who writes a story like Buncha Schweig, Buncha the Silent. While the world is Europe is killing Jews left and right, so Buncha is a pious man who goes to heaven. He was so poor in his life, he never knew a day in which his stomach was full. He never knew a day in which he didn't work like a dog for very little. And he gets to the pearly gates, so to speak, and God says, you can have anything your heart desires, Buncha. What will it be? And Buncha Schweig says, if it's okay with you, could I have a little roll with butter for breakfast? Right? Now, the question would be, what would Donald Trump answer? Different needs for different.
Rabbi, you were good up until that point.
Well,
That's
talking different needs.
With those words, you should have Shabbos lunch. We should just leave well enough unspoken.
But, with him, no, there's an answer for you. And I could give you an answer. Today, it could have been the presidency, but that it's never enough with him because he thinks of himself and he's been told that he's a loser and he doesn't want to be a loser.
Yeah. I mean, I don't go any further than that, but I'm just saying different people have different needs, but we're the same. We have the same makeup today as we had 2,800 years ago. So the writers of Torah understood there would be greedy people, there would be power hungry people, there would be sick people, there would be people in need, there would be people who could give and were generous, and people who were stingy and selfish. There would be people who took and people who donated. And the Torah's laws are trying to get people to go in the other direction. Give of yourself. It's a short life. You're born with your hands closed, as if to say, I'm going to grab everything, but you die with your hands open, as if to say, I ain't taking nothing with me. So while you're alive, practice opening your hands and your heart and your mind and your spirit and be generous, because otherwise you cause war. And that's what Torah is saying. I mean, these laws of sacrifice are give of what you have so that others can have also, so that you realize you are not 100% responsible for what you grew. Some of it came from a different source, came because the earth was good, came because the seeds were good, came because the rain came down, came because the animals were at a certain spot in their development, came because of this or that or the other thing. You're not 100% responsible for what you did and what you accomplished. You got to where you are because of other elements and because of other people. So therefore, open up a little bit, be generous. And that's what the Constitution was trying to do, was trying to keep people from eating each other, was trying to say, hey, look, everybody's got a mind, let everybody express themselves. Everybody's got a mouth, let them speak out, right? Let investigations take place and let the press be free. Let people gather to talk about things. So, so the Constitution goes and it puts people in power in their place, tells them what they can do and what they can't do, how they're elected, how they're not elected, et cetera. So the Constitution gives a framework, not in terms of God, the Torah in terms of God, because they don't know what else to put it in terms of. What else, what other authority can we refer to? We can't refer to the police department. There is none. We can't refer to prisons and jails. There are none. We can't refer to, a bazillion things that we have today. So God's watching. Therefore, do it this way, not this way.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Before Rabbi Mazel
just
Tov, I need
referring-
to. Adios, Shabbat Shalom, and Mazel Tov.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Keep asking if you need. I need to jump on another one.
Okay.
Blessings.
Rabbi, when Mel Coffey defines his several questions, I would love to attend even a special session if you wanted to do it.
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
I'm a part of the Zoom generation.
Yeah.
Rabbi, I always shake my head. Excuse me. I shake. The Constitution is so applicable today. And back then they didn't have PCs, TVs, New York Times. It's just, I'm awed over it. I don't know how they could have done that.
Well, they thought it through based on what they knew from human nature. And so did the Torah. It was based on human nature of what people are all about. And so whoever wrote either one of those documents was a genius. And the Constitution, the Torah, the laws of the Torah are not in conflict. They're pretty much on target. There's no law of sacrifice in the Constitution, but the rest of the laws are pretty much on target, and especially the moral laws, right? Today's Torah portion, this afternoon's Torah portion is about free loan society. Give money to the poor, lend money to the poor so they can get ahead. What the heck are you think we're arguing about $1.9 trillion about giving money to poor and so they can get their business going. And so all other things can happen too. So they can pay their rent and feed their kids and get through this pandemic. I mean, it's as relevant today as it was 2,800 years ago, for crying out loud. And so forth and so on. So that's just one of the things I'm going to tell the kids. Anyway, 4 o'clock for anybody who wants to join in. Love to have you. And a huge catered dinner afterwards, virtually. So you just make up your own menus and come enjoy.
Rabbi, today's Torah portion, what you said, in essence, a sermon, was beautiful.
Thank you, Al. Thank you.
Rabbi, Mazel Tov to you and your family, and Shabbat Shalom. I've got to jump off.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. Thank you.
Rabbi, thank you.
And Mazel Tov.
Bye, y'all.
Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos to everyone. Have a really good Shabbos.
With yourself and with your family.
Thank you much. Take care, all. Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.